Movie games on consoles are an interesting topic that present many unusual ideas to capitalise on the popularity of iconic film franchises, with some reaching great heights of success, while others better off being left where you found them. We have previously discovered the multitude of movie-inspired video games on both the Sega Master System and Game Gear consoles that provide an interesting blend of notable and not so good titles that, for better or worse, are a reflection of their time, with developers looking to add their own ideas, adding to the legacy of memorable experiences. Some worked, while others, let's just say, they could have been a lot better. But now it is time to visit the many more movie-inspired games that found home on the Sega, Genesis or Megadrive 16-bit console that would present better visuals, gameplay and audio quality compared to earlier systems. But are these versions any better? Well, you will need to stick around and watch the video to find out as we dive into this diverse list of interesting games that made their way from the cinema screen to console, where we will look at the many quirks and nuances surrounding them. So let's dive in. With Home Alone being one of the most successful and iconic movies of all time, it was inevitable that video game ports would be developed on many systems and consoles to capitalise on the movie's popularity. While the movie itself has stood the test of time, the games, however, unfortunately haven't. There would be different versions of the game available on Sega consoles, with both the Game Gear and Genesis versions playing very similar to each other in how they look, play and feel, allowing you to use a sled to travel through the streets and gardens surrounding your home and neighbourhood, with the intention to enter houses and set traps to stop the wet bandits from stealing and vandalising each of the properties. The Master System version is very different, as it acts more like an action platformer, with the bandits already in each home, and you also have to find and hide items before they get to them, but you can never go outside unlike the other versions. You cannot set traps once the bandits are in the house that you have entered. Instead, you have to grab items and hide them before they can get anywhere near them. The overall idea behind the game can be quite confusing to understand at first, as it isn't fully apparent on what you need to do in the beginning, but you also have to contend with so many other factors that will contribute to an overall frustrating experience. And if you fail to save all of the houses in the area, or you get caught, then it is game over. These games presented a missed opportunity to fully take advantage of the movie's success. Instead, you were left with quite simply one of the worst movie ports ever seen on systems. Wayne's World, upon its release in 1993 on consoles with the SNES, NES, Genesis and Game Boy, was met with heavy criticism, noting it to be one of the worst video games ever created, with uninspiring gameplay and visual design that would be classed as a complete waste of a movie license, especially with the Genesis version. The game would often be seen as quite annoying and frustrating by many who played it at the time, where only loyal fans of the movies would see any actual appeal to the game. It didn't get much better in Home Alone 2 after the failed attempt of the first game, reprising the role of Kevin, now lost in New York City, taking him through many locations, starting off in the airport and eventually finding his way to the Plaza Hotel, Central Park, many city streets and his uncle's townhouse, with the wet bandits in constant pursuit to take revenge on him after the events of the first movie once they have gotten out of jail. You will have to run, jump, collect items and use weapons to take out enemies or to avoid them altogether, along with the many other hazards you will face. There are many other versions of the game that were planned for other consoles, with many of them being cancelled due to the negative reception of the console versions. The Genesis version of the game was developed in-house by Sega of America, with a European version that was being planned, but it too was cancelled due to the game's poor reception. The reviews in magazines of the time stated that it was also one of the worst movie tie-ins and sequels ever seen in video games. Last Action Hero sees you take on the role of Jack Slater from the film, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, taking on a variety of different mission objectives in each stage, ranging from the cinema realm to the real world, with the aim to stop the main enemy, Mr. Benedict. The gameplay, functions, controls, and strict time limits present an annoying and often frustrating experience for players, with it often being regarded as one of the worst games ever created. Last Action Hero received severely negative reviews upon its launch, criticising its high difficulty and uninspiring gameplay that felt like a rushed attempt to capitalise on the popularity of the movie during that time. Pretty much every version of the game released, regardless of the platform it made its way to, was panned by critics and players alike. As with many of these games, they sound good on paper, but the final product rarely lives up to what is expected. This is a clear example of the rushed development procedures, with companies looking to quickly cash in on popular trends to make a fast buck, with no consideration for genuine quality or playability, as in most cases, it isn't the developers themselves that make these decisions, but that of the corporate individuals and CEOs looking only to profit from trends, with a complete disregard for people's wants, needs, interests or opinions. And as a result of this, it is the game itself and the people that buy them are the ones that suffer. Ariel the Little Mermaid was released on the Genesis in 1992 and got ports to both the Game Gear and Master System sometime later, which I have covered in previous videos. There will be links in the description below. The game has some references to the movie but acts more as its own standalone plot, with the goal being able to collect items in each level to progress while avoiding enemies and hazards. The levels consist mainly of a labyrinthian design, requiring you to navigate and search all areas to find items needed to complete each stage. You can also collect treasures, which can be used in a shop to purchase additional side characters to be summoned and help you out as you play. Reviews of the game stated that it was short and lacked variety in its approach and its gameplay, while having decent visuals, but greatly suffers from slowdown if too many sprites appear on the screen at the same time. It is often considered as one of the worst Disney games on the system. However, it was stated that the game would be more suitable for a much more younger audience of players. The only game based on the movie seen on the Megadrive, which also got released on many other systems, even the Master System, and is a massive improvement from Back to the Future 2. But like its predecessor, Back to the Future 3 still suffers with its high level of difficulty right from the beginning, which will require a lot of trial and error and a lot of frustration before you can get in a complete run. There are a total of 4 levels in the game that all range from different play styles, adding much diversity to the gameplay, but the high difficulty curve really lets it down. But it has some decent visuals and unique ideas which make up for it if you can be patient with the gameplay mechanics. Terminator 2 Judgment Day is a side-scrolling action game based on the legendary movie released in 1991 that follows the journey of the Terminator machine sent back from the future to find and protect a young John Connor, the future leader of the worldwide resistance, from the formidable T-1000 that will take you through many scenes from the bar, the psychiatric hospital and other areas seen in the movie itself, while facing many opponents and completing various tasks to be able to progress. The game was released on multiple systems, seeing versions be developed by different companies from LJN and Flying Edge. These versions do differ in their gameplay ideas, with many console ports, especially on 8-bit systems, being side-scrolling action games, while other versions would add more variety with action and driving sequences. The variety of games released ranged in quality also, with some seen as decent while others not meeting the standards of similar games in these genres, often being stated in reviews as a wasted opportunity to capitalise on one of the greatest movies ever made. No Escape is a side-scrolling action game based off of the 1994 film of the same name, where you play as Captain J.T. Robbins, whose only objective of the game is to escape an island. The player must explore the island with side-scrolling platforming gameplay, looking for clues, finding items and combining them to make weapons and traps. Robbins can talk to some of the prisoners to help him on his quest, but he must also avoid the many violent prisoners that roam the island, either by attacking them with punches or kicks or using traps, and using stealth to bypass them. The graphics are based on rotoscopes of the actual actors from the movie, adding a distinct level of detail compared to other games of its type on the console. It was released for the Sega Megadrive exclusively in North America. A Sega CD version was also planned but cancelled in late 1994 for unknown reasons. While it does have some distinctive quirks, it wouldn't stop the game from being panned by critics for its sluggish and poor controls, often citing that there are better games to play on the console that are more worth your time. Batman Forever is a side-scrolling beat-em-up game based off of the film that saw a release in the arcade originally and later on the Sega Genesis along with the Game Gear, Master System and SNES consoles in 1995. The Genesis, SNES, Game Boy and Game Gear versions are entirely different from Batman Forever the arcade game, with that title being a traditional beat-em-up similar to games like Streets of Rage and Final Fight, whereas the console ports are side-scrolling action games that play very similarly to Mortal Kombat Mythologies that was released on the Sony PlayStation and Nintendo 64 in 1997. The arcade version of Batman Forever would later get ports to both the Sega Saturn and PlayStation consoles in 1996. The player can choose between either Batman or Robin. There is also a variety of modes from single player, co-op and a training mode where the player can choose between Batman, Robin or any of the enemies found throughout the game to fight against computer controlled opponents or against a second player, with a 2v2 mode to work cooperatively against two computer opponents. The controls are largely based on move lists and key sequences similarly seen in the Mortal Kombat games, as it was developed using the same game engine using digitized images for the character sprites. The gadget list is selected by the player at each level, with 3 standard gadgets for each character and 2 gadgets selected from a list. There are also 4 hidden blueprint gadgets that you can find throughout the campaign. While the game itself looks to have some impressive ideas for its time on paper, if we compared it to the 2 previous Batman German titles also seen on the Genesis. It falls short regarding the overall gameplay, as it can be quite slow and clunky with the controls. Plus you will find yourself wandering around similar environments and fighting the same enemy types over and over, which will get repetitive very quickly. The previous games didn't really have this issue, as yes, they were challenging, but they had a better balance between combat and exploration to mix things up a little, but the same really can't be said here. While there are hidden areas to discover, you'll more than likely miss them, due to everything looking the same in every room you venture into, and are likely to miss out on very important items. The reviews weren't kind to this game, and also mentioned that they saw it as one of the worst Batman games on video game systems at the time during this era, that had little to no relation to the previous entries. Cliffhanger is a beat-em-up platform game that was released in 1993 and is based on the film, which saw a release on many home consoles of the time, seeing major gameplay differences between 16 and 8-bit consoles. The Genesis, Megadrive, SNES and the Sega CD versions are almost identical and feature gameplay similar to iconic street brawlers like Double Dragon, Final Fight and Streets of Rage. The Sega CD version contains a 3D snowboarding sequence where the player has to escape from an avalanche. Otherwise, the gameplay on 16-bit systems is the same across the board. The Amiga, NES, Game Boy and Game Gear versions, however, use a simpler side-scrolling perspective for its gameplay. Critics destroyed this game in reviews across all versions, stating it to be one of the worst, if not the worst, of movie tie-ins ever made. It won an award for Worst Movie-Inspired Game in 1994, so that will give you an idea of how bad some of these versions are. I also recently played the Game Gear version, which I recently covered in a previous video, and the overall quality of that game is extremely poor, to say the least, as it just feels like the game was rushed just to get it onto store shelves. The 16-bit versions do fare a little bit better in some regards, but they still leave you questioning many ideas as to why such games even exist, as they could have been so much better had more time been put into the development, but that is rarely the case with movie-inspired games seen during this generation. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade was released on many consoles, even older home computers of the time, with the Amstrad CPC, Amiga, Atari ST, ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, and on home consoles with the NES, Master System, Game Gear, and Sega Genesis. The game is a side-scrolling action platforming adventure game, seeing Indy on a quest to rescue his father that will take him through many interesting locations, searching caves and tombs looking for lost treasure. The Genesis version is different from the other variants that are out in the gaming landscape, with it being unique and exclusive to the console with more distinctive gameplay elements, but it still suffers from the high frustrating difficulty level with strict time limits and not being able to use Indy's whip more often, as it only has limited uses before forcing you to find another one on your travels to aid in dispatching enemies. It is a gameplay mechanic that developers thought would be good at the time, but in reality only increases the overall frustration of the experience. However, the game does provide a better overall playing experience compared to many of its counterparts, but still suffers from similar issues as seen in those games, holding it back from being a true great on the console. Based on the feature film of the same name, Cutthroat Island casts players in the role of renegade treasure hunters. The player is able to choose between two characters, a male and female character, who are armed with their own distinct weapons from rapiers to swords. The game was released in 1995 on the Genesis, SNES, Game Boy and Game Gear consoles, featuring both single player and two player action modes with differing gameplay styles to choose between swordplay and brawling. The player's character must battle through a variety of levels, encountering various foes such as rival pirates and other enemy types. The gameplay is quite similar to beat 'em up games like Golden Axe that mix weapons with melee combat. As the player progresses through the game, several items such as knives, bombs, bottles, torches, hammers, pistols and other weapons are collectible and will be needed to defeat the hordes of enemies that are relentless throughout. Even with all of these elements in the game, it didn't fare well with reviews, panning the game for its fiddly controls and repetitive gameplay. Beauty and the Beast, Belle's Quest, is part of a series of games published in 1993 on the Sega Genesis to reflect the popularity of the movie released earlier in 1991. You play as Belle on a quest to find her father, an eccentric inventor by the name of Maurice, who has been held captive in an old castle for trespassing that is owned by the Beast himself, who was once a prince, having been transformed due to a curse laid upon him and his servants for his arrogance. Your journey will take you through many locations similar to that seen in the film, from a town, village, a dark forest, eventually to the castle, where you will have to avoid enemies and obstacles while solving many puzzles along the way. Unlike other Disney titles, the gameplay is very simplistic in its approach and isn't overly difficult. That aims itself at a much more younger audience of players, and it also plays very differently from its alternative entry, also released on the system, known as Roar of the Beast. Beauty and the Beast, Roar of the Beast, is the second entry in this series that was released on the Genesis console in 1993, and in this title you play as the Prince Beast himself, trying to defend his castle from an attack that sees you explore many of the locations from within the castle grounds and rooms, requiring you to defeat many enemies using combat from punches and special attacks. It is a very different experience from its counterpart, with more action and great visuals, but is often considered as a very difficult game, due to the sheer amount of enemy encounters you will face in each level, with health items being hard to find along the way. Initially released for Sega platforms, Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, was later ported to the Atari Jaguar and Super Nintendo Entertainment System, each one featuring several changes and additions compared to that of seen in the original version. These 16-bit versions played as a typical fighting game similar to Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter II, which had impressive visuals but was deemed overly difficult to be enjoyable and became overwhelmingly frustrating in the early stages as a result. There would be ports of the game added to both the Game Gear and Master System consoles, which were also released in 1994, but feature an entirely different gameplay format using a side-scrolling action beat-em-up perspective, but lacked many elements such as the background music, only listening to the sound effects of character interactions and combat sequences. Since its release, Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, was mostly met with negative reviews, with criticism directed at the slow-paced and shallow gameplay. Finding Nemo isn't an official release on the console, but simply a game hack based off of the gameplay mechanics seen in James Pond Robocod that would also been released on the Genesis console, that utilises similar gameplay elements from that game, where you play as Nemo, exploring a variety of different levels and hidden areas to find items and defeat enemies. The game has a simplistic design with some interesting cartoony visuals, and while the game displays some references to the film, it doesn't have any official plot related to the movie itself, as it stands as its own individual experience. This game hack features the Hercules character from the Disney movie. It is an action platformer, similar to the gameplay seen in the PlayStation release in 1997, with its own distinctive visual design and animated cartoon style graphics, reflecting those seen in the film. The game will also take you through many environments, including lakes, caves and forests, while you defeat enemies using your sword and special abilities. There is very little information that can be found online, apart from a few written articles, but even with that, the description of the game is quite vague. So the best way to understand it would be to play it for yourself to know what is happening. Mulan is an unlicensed game for the Sega Megadrive, based on the Disney film of the same name that was released in 1998. It is an action platformer game where you must take control of Mulan through 4 levels with a few sub-stages, in a recreation of the film's plot with each level. You will jump and climb your way through many locations on each stage, while using a sword to defeat enemies. This is a fan-made game, however, so it isn't of the same quality seen in other Disney-inspired titles, as it does have many flaws, but is better than some of the other fan-inspired games that are seen out there. Fantasia was developed by Infogrames and released by Sega for the Genesis Megadrive console in 1991, which takes its inspiration from the movie of the same name released way back in the 1940s. You take control of Mickey Mouse as a sorcerer with powerful magic abilities as you navigate various side-scrolling levels, collecting musical notes to play a song that will help you to progress to the next stage. Sega wanted to capitalise on the overwhelming success of Castle of Illusion, but development timeframes were limited due to the upcoming release of Sonic the Hedgehog's first outing on the console, which led to the game being rushed, with no final tweaks or polish of the gameplay, which resulted in a subpar experience that was nowhere near the level of quality seen in Castle of Illusion. Sega really did miss an opportunity with this game, as it was meant to reflect the success and nostalgia of one of Disney's earliest and most successful movies ever, but failed to deliver on so many fronts with poor controls and collision detection, while making it difficult to navigate platforming sections. Even defeating enemies would become troublesome. This would heavily be reflected in its reviews, which stated that the game had great visuals, but everything else was well below playable standards, and that the game was far too difficult to make it enjoyable. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is an action platformer game based on the 1994 film of the same name, being released on both the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, with the player controlling Frankenstein's monster as he is on a quest seeking revenge against his creator for rejecting him upon his creation. The game follows the plot of the movie closely, with some alterations, progressing through levels, engaging with enemies, using weapons and abilities, while needing to solve puzzles along the way. The game was criticised heavily, however, regarding its poor, sluggish controls and level design elements, with the Genesis version receiving most of the criticism regarding its visuals, as they looked subpar and not up to the standards of other games on the system. Superman released in 1992 and would be developed by Sunsoft for the Megadrive or Genesis console, that acts as a traditional single-player side-scrolling arcade game where the player controls Superman himself through various levels in an effort to defeat the evil supervillain known as Brainiac. The game was also planned to be released on the Super Nintendo, but was cancelled before its completion. Versions of the game, however, did make its way onto the Sega Master System and Game Gear consoles, being developed by Kraft Gold under the name of Superman, the Man of Steel. Each level in the game begins with an article from the Daily Planet announcing that some supervillain is wreaking havoc on the city. The game is quite restrictive in its playstyle, as it totally limits Superman's powers to jumping, punching and kicking, where he can only use them by collecting certain icons or power-ups scattered throughout the level that are required to accomplish a certain task. These gameplay mechanics were often met with much criticism, as it doesn't make much sense to fully restrict all of Superman's powers, as almost everything in the game can damage him as if he were just a normal human. So the game itself just ended up being a typical action platformer. But this also proved at the time that developers really did not know how to approach the idea of superhero games, and it would take a long time before developers would fully understand the material. An example of this would later be seen in the Batman Arkham series on the PS3, Xbox 360 and PC of later generations. Hook, the video game, would release on a multitude of different consoles and in the arcade between the years of 1992 and 1993 to try and capitalise off of the popularity of the movie. Each of the platform-specific versions would end up having different perspectives, from side-scrolling action to platforming and even beat-em-up style elements that are similar to games like Streets of Rage and Golden Axe. The console versions would be mostly the side-scrolling action game iterations that sees you exploring various locations that include caves, forests, lagoons and snowy mountains, but ratings would be mixed across the board, as although while each game played different from their counterparts, it was difficult to determine which was the superior game from the list. But the games are quite challenging and difficult, and often regarded as being too frustrating to be fun in most regards, so many of them do suffer in terms of their overall quality. The Smurfs is a 2D platform game created by Infogrames for the NES, the Game Boy, the Sega Master System, the Megadrive, Sega CD, Game Gear in 1994 and 1995, with a port later added to the Nintendo Wii Virtual Console. The game is a side-scrolling platformer with cartoon-style visuals that is inspired by the popular TV series that ran during the 80s and early 90s, with your goal being to rescue your friends that have been captured by an evil sorcerer. The IP has seen a massive resurgence in modern times, with movies being created and being inspired by both the TV, cartoon and games alike. Three Ninjas Kickback is a side-scrolling action game releasing on the Genesis, SNES and Sega CD in 1994. It was developed by Malibu Interactive and published by Psygnosis. Sony ImageSoft would handle the publishing rights for the Sega CD and SNES versions. The story follows the events of three young ninja students on a quest to find and retrieve a stolen dagger that will take you through many locations, requiring you to engage in combat to defeat enemies to progress. The game does present some interesting ideas, however, clunky controls and repetitive gameplay would often overshadow them, but will appeal to fans of the movie. The Page Master is a platforming and adventure game, released in 1994, being added to consoles with the SNES, Game Boy and Sega Genesis. It was developed by Probe Software and published by Fox Interactive. You must guide a character through a selection of literature, genre-themed levels, ranging from horror to fantasy worlds, where you will use magic and melee attacks that can be used to defeat enemies that will include bats, flying books, giant hands, ghosts, pirates and more. The game has some impressive visuals and art style, with some interesting interesting ideas, but it was found to be quite repetitive with poor controls, not helping the experience. RoboCop 3 was released on different home personal computers and games consoles between 1991 and 1993, with different iterations being developed depending on the system it was released on. The console ports played from a side-scrolling action perspective, with the PC, Amiga and Atari ST versions having multiple elements from action to driving scenes. Development, however, didn't go as according to plan, especially with the home computer ports, as developers had little reference, with only having access to still images from the movie for inspiration, which caused much confusion, resulting in taking much longer to complete the overall game. The console ports themselves didn't fare much better, as the games were classed as being overly difficult, making it a chore and very frustrating for players, with some versions, especially on 8-bit systems, would see enemy projectiles constantly hit you off screen, losing all of your lives in the process, requiring multiple tries before you get a successful run in. This game would be a far cry from the later RoboCop vs Terminator, while having been developed by a different company, managed to create a dark, action-filled experience, being also seen as one of the bloodiest and most violent games of the 16-bit era, and also one of the better games seen during that generation of consoles. Predator 2 would release on consoles, with the Sega Genesis, Master System, NES and Game Gear in 1992, taking inspiration from the film, seeing you play through many levels, facing off against an aggressive horde of gangland criminals, waging an all-out war across the city, while also contending with the silent and relentless pursuit of the Predator. The game plays from an overhead or isometric perspective, depending on which platform you are playing on, but plays mostly the same across the board. You will take out enemies with the many weapons and explosive pickups you will acquire along the way. The game is difficult as enemies constantly spawn all around you, being able to hit you from all directions, with the game never giving you a break to become familiar with your environment, as the combat is so relentless, and this has heavily reflected upon the game's reviews of the time. Stargate is a 1995 platform game by Acclaim Entertainment for the Super Nintendo and Genesis. It follows the adventures of Colonel Jack O'Neill on a quest to free the slaves of Abydos and get his team back home using the Stargate device. The game is based on the 1994 film of the same name. The gameplay is typical of the side-scrolling platform games of the era, requiring players to run, shoot, solve puzzles while completing tasks to proceed. The game does have some decent visuals, but has some major drawbacks and flaws, holding it back from being a true classic, which were reflected upon its reviews of the time, but stated that loyal fans of the movie would get some appeal from the experience. Warlock is a side-scrolling action video game based on the 1989 horror film. It was released in 1995 through Acclaim Entertainment for the Genesis and SNES platforms. As a druid, the player is armed with different spells that will aid him in his battle against the Warlock to prevent him from acquiring runestones, which he intends to use to destroy the world. The game has some interesting quirks and elements, but they ultimately failed to aid in the game's reviews of the time, stating that the game felt very repetitive and that the SNES version was the better of the two games to play. Based on the 1992 horror film Bram Stoker's Dracula, ports were developed for many consoles and home systems and released in 1993 to capitalise on the success of the movie. The 8 and 16-bit console editions would be side-scrolling action platformers that use a similar style to Master of Darkness on the Master System and the early Castlevania games seen on the NES console, where you explore levels, finding items and weapons, being faced with multiple end and mid-level boss fights as you progress to the final altercation with Dracula himself. Other versions of the game with the Sega CD, DOS and Amiga editions would play from different perspectives, being completely different experiences from the console counterparts. True Lies is a top-down run-and-gun video game based on the 1994 film True Lies that was published by Acclaim Entertainment. There were 4 different versions of the game that were released on the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Game Gear and the Nintendo Game Boy. The home and portable versions are drastically different from each other but have similar play mechanics. Each stage will see players fulfill a set number of objectives along with eliminating the many enemies that surround each area to proceed. You will start with a standard pistol with unlimited ammo, but will find more powerful weapons along your journey to aid in quickly dispatching enemies. The game does have some interesting features, but is often mentioned as rather frustrating as it can take many hits to eliminate enemies, with some of the versions on handheld systems being slated for the sluggish gameplay. The SNES version is often seen as the most definitive way to play the game in its current state. Universal Soldier is an action game released for the Sega Megadrive in 1992. Though the game was sold in stores, it was not licensed by Sega. The game is essentially a reworking of Turrican 2 to act as a tie-in for the film that features very similar action sequences and level design elements, while only having some references to the movie with regards to the boss fights, where you will fight extremely oversized variants of Dolph Lundgren's character. But aside from that, it has no relation to the movie itself, just with it being in its name alone. If you have played any of the Turrican games before, you will be familiar with the gameplay elements with a heavy emphasis on combat and exploration in a run and gun style format. It is a challenging game with the levels being long and at times frustrating, as it is very confusing to know where to go to next. Disney's Pinocchio is a platform puzzle adventure game released for the Genesis in 1996. The game would also be ported to the Nintendo Game Boy and SNES consoles, and is based off of the classic animated feature film, originally released in 1940. Pinocchio follows the events of the film with many story sequences playing in between levels. The game combines interactive puzzles and side-scrolling elements with visually impressive graphics and backdrops, among some of the best seen on a Disney game on the Sega Genesis itself. But the game wasn't well received, however, due to its limited popularity, with critics panning it for its clunky, sluggish controls and vague puzzle elements that would often confuse players. The Lawnmower Man is a video game adaptation of the movie, releasing originally in 1993 on the SNES and DOS systems, and later in 1994 and 1995 on other systems including the Sega Genesis. From the get-go, Lawnmower Man is a very different experience from other titles on the console, as in many ways it was ahead of its time, as it produced many interesting ideas for each of the levels, from side-scrolling action to first-person running and shooting, using elements seen in early 3D FPS shooters, pushing the console beyond its limits, further than was thought possible for the time. The game would play through different events and locations from the movie, while using its distinct mix of gameplay styles, requiring you to collect items, weapons and upgrades, while engaging in combat sequences to proceed. While the game showcased many interesting concepts, it was met with mixed feedback with reviewers of the time, struggling to understand the game's overall concept, with them slating some elements like the controls but praising the interesting and unusual ideas for the level design in each stage. Demolition Man, released on multiple gaming systems in 1995, that acted as more of a run and gun experience, with different playstyles changing at different stages to an over-the-top perspective and side-scrolling elements. The game would be quite difficult, as you only have limited lives and continues to complete the campaign, as levels can be quite long, with many enemy encounters and obstacles to overcome, which can be tricky to deal with. There was a version of the game developed for the Panasonic 3DO console that was more in line with the movie itself, that had different elements from one-on-one fighting levels to action events, while using many video cutscenes and soundtrack elements from that of the movie. It had its quirks, but also some flaws that often hold it back, and is often considered as a very underrated game, with it subsequently being better than many of the other movie ports seen on these consoles. Judge Dredd was released on the Genesis in 1995, with ports being added to the SNES and Sega Game Gear. A PC version was released a year later, which received a re-release on Steam in recent times. The game made use of a variety of different assets by digitising sets from the movie to use as backgrounds in most of the levels, while the remaining levels use backgrounds based off of that seen in the comic books. It plays like a typical run and gun game, with platforming and puzzle elements, along with gathering ammo and resources for your weapons, forcing you to explore each of the environments while finding the exit to proceed to the next stage. The game received mostly positive reviews, with the Game Gear version featuring more linear levels and ending with the final fight with Rico, unlike the Megadrive version, but stated at the end of level bosses being often more difficult to defeat. Punisher is a port of the popular 1993 arcade game released on the Genesis in 1994 in North America and Europe in 1995, and is a side-scrolling beat-em-up that plays very similar to genre icons like Final Fight and Streets of Rage. The game itself is more ties to the comic books rather than that seen in any of the movies, where you play as Frank Castle, the Punisher himself, while also having access to an additional character with Nick Fury, where you are on a mission to take down the Kingpin once and for all. You can utilise many combat skills while using a variety of different weapons, from pistols, machine guns and explosives, to dispatch large groups of enemies faster. It is an interesting game and will appeal to fans of side-scrolling beat-em-ups. While not as polished as the arcade original, it is still a blast to play co-op with friends. This can be quite confusing, as the game states that it is a Hercules game, but it's a completely different experience, being a hack of another game known as Dana Megami Tanjo, where you play as a female goddess character that has powers and abilities similar to Hercules, who struggles against the powers of an evil sorceress raiding her village. The story is told through cutscenes, as various mythical beasts help Dana. Dana is capable of a few attacks, with players being able to use a sword to stab and slash enemies, and is also capable of using magic spells, powered by magic orbs fallen from enemies. Dana can summon different magic abilities from thunder magic, fire and a thick fog that can be used to either blind or do more damage to enemies depending on how full the magic bar is. This would be a gameplay mechanic that would be similarly seen in the Golden Axe series. It is quite a violent game, not often seen during this console generation, but it is definitely worth a try. Batman Returns would release on the Sega Genesis console in 1992, with additional ports of the game being added across many systems and consoles that would change the gameplay dynamic with a mix of other genres. The Sega console editions with the Genesis, Master System and Game Gear would be action platformers, with 8-bit versions being slightly more simplistic in their approach, but are still very challenging games. The Genesis version would be slow paced, with more uses of combat, weapons and special abilities, while using Batman's utility belt to inflict heavy damage on more powerful enemies and bosses. The levels are exploration focused, with many hidden items to find in secret areas off screen, hidden rooms, while trying to be aware of the many enemies and traps that lie in wait. Some of the most notable aspects of the game would be the visuals and music tracks. Even though reviewers of the time didn't speak highly of them, they are among some of the most impressive on the console. The visuals themselves do a great job of reflecting Tim Burton's design of Gotham City in the movies, with dark tones, unique ambience and atmosphere that stand out from other Batman games of the time. This design idea would be completely different from the SNES version being released and developed by Konami that would be a beat 'em up with a similar visual style to Final Fight, another icon in the beat 'em up genre. When I was growing up, Batman Returns would have been one of my favourite games to play on the Genesis, as I got to play this a lot through a friend owning the game growing up, and I would find myself often playing the game at the weekends when we went down to visit, putting many hours into the experience, but yet it was also very challenging. One of the hardest games I've ever had to play on the Genesis itself, but I still find myself every so often revisiting the game just to relive the nostalgia, to witness the graphics, and to just listen to the soundtrack in all its glory, as I definitely think it's one of the better, visually impressive games on the Genesis itself, and I definitely think it has one of the best soundtracks. The Genesis version itself of Batman Returns has 5 main levels with different chapters in each, and overall the game is a solid but very difficult experience that is different from Batman's first game on the Genesis, but a worthwhile attempt, and is definitely one of the better movie to game adaptations seen during this time. In the Addams Family, you play as Gomez on a quest to save and rescue each member of your family from the clutches of Abigail Craven, who is trying to steal the family's secret fortune. This side-scrolling action platforming adventure takes you on a journey where you must explore dark rooms and eerie locations inside and around the grounds of the family estate. The game was developed in collaboration with Ocean Software and Acclaim Entertainment for the Sega Genesis in 1992. Flying Edge would develop the game for the Master System and Game Gear consoles also in 1992. And there would also be other versions ported to many other systems and personal computers of the time, with the Genesis version being considered among the better of the game ports, with great visuals, sound effects and gameplay that did suffer due to increasing and unbalanced difficulty, but it was heavily compared to other platformers of the time, which didn't help the game's appeal to players. Dick Tracy is based on the 1990 film of the same name. It was published by Sega for the Genesis in early 1991, with ports being added to other consoles during the time, seeing home also on the Master System, NES, Game Boy, MS-DOS and Amiga. Dick Tracy is a hard-boiled detective trying to take down criminal organisations set within a fictional 1930s American city that plays as an action game as you fight and shoot your way through groups of gangsters to unravel the mystery. Each stage has 3 scenes, with the last involving a boss fight against one of the gangsters. Every scene has a foreground and background segment, allowing you to interact and shoot enemies that are on different parts of the scene that look as though they are just across the street but in the distance, which is an interesting mechanic that few games used during this era. This gave the impression that it was an action game and light gun title all in one. The game also had some decent visuals that reflected the movie's style, especially that scene on the Megadrive, but was considered to be a very difficult experience due to the insane amount of never-ending enemies that would randomly appear on screen as you played. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie seen various video game adaptations of the film releasing for the SNES, Genesis, Game Boy and Sega Game Gear. While the games are mainly based on the film, they also feature characters and plot elements from the original TV series. Each version of the game is different, with the SNES and Game Boy being side-scrolling action games, with the Game Gear playing as a fighting game similar to Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat, with the Genesis acting as an arcade beat-em-up similar to Icons with Final Fight and Streets of Rage. The game does have some subtle flaws, but it has great visuals and an epic soundtrack, while having a co-op mode to play with friends that will allow you to revisit and play as your favourite characters from this iconic series. The Jungle Book follows the events of the iconic movie from the 1960s, with many ports seeing releases on home consoles of the time. Many references are made noticeable throughout each of the game's levels, from the interactable objects, character designs and enemy sprites to boss fights that fans will relate to. Out of all of the versions of the game available, the Genesis entry is seen as the superior port that stood out from all other entries, that while having interesting quirks, didn't play as well as this version. As it stands, the Genesis is seen as the best way to play the game to this current day. Addams Family Values is a very different experience from its predecessor, releasing in 1995 on the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo, that would play from an overhead perspective with a selection of role-playing elements, taking on the role of Uncle Fester on a quest to save his nephew who has been kidnapped. You will control Uncle Fester through many locations, searching for items, solving puzzles, along with defeating enemies and bosses that will try to stop you from proceeding. The game was met with solid reviews, stating it had great visuals, sound and well thought out gameplay, being among some of the better games of this type seen on the console. T2, the arcade game, is a light gun shooter based on the film of the same name, being developed in tandem with the movie, with several actors from the film reprising their roles, being created using photorealistic digitised graphics. The game's plot largely follows that of the film, playing as the T-800 Terminator, cyborg from the film itself, sent back in time to protect John Connor from assassination by the T-1000 Terminator. The game would be a success in arcades, with ports of the game being added to home consoles under the name T2, the arcade game. to avoid confusion with the numerous tie-ins of the game being made on other consoles that were also based off of the movie. Compared to other versions, reviews of this game were well received among critics, especially on 16-bit consoles, stating that much effort was made to keep the gameplay and visuals as close to the arcade version as possible. The only criticism would be lacking the use of the light-gun peripherals, especially on 8-bit systems, mainly with the Master System, as the game wasn't compatible with the light gun, forcing players to use the standard controller, which only limited the gameplay appeal. The iconic Jurassic Park movie would see many games released on a variety of different consoles, being released in 1993, and the game would be developed by Blue Sky Software that would see home on the Sega Genesis, with ports also being added to the Sega Master System, Game Gear, NES and SNES consoles, along with other systems that would play very different from the Megadrive edition. This version of Jurassic Park is a side-scrolling action game with platforming gameplay elements. The objective is to reach the end of each level while using items placed at fixed locations to help you on your journey. The game features the option of using two characters, either Dr. Alan Grant or a Raptor. Alan Grant is the default character of the game, but the Raptor allows you to play through similar levels, but changes the dynamic as you need to use alternative means or routes to access areas as smaller spaces are inaccessible, whereas in Grant's character you can use them. The game can be quite challenging, with some inherent flaws that can cause your character to fall completely off the map, off screen, after a misplaced jump or short fall, often requiring you to start the level over from the beginning. Luckily the levels are quite short once you understand where to go, so after some practice it won't take that long to complete. The game, due to the popularity of the movie, broke sales records in its first week, making over $13.4 million, which was rare for many games to achieve such a high financial goal in such a short time frame, especially on the Sega Genesis. Dune, The Battle for Arrakis is a reworking of Dune 2 for the Genesis, releasing in 1993, that would be a pure strategy game, which would be a step away from other movie adaptations seen on the console. It would be a solid port of the original title that plays very similar to games like Command & Conquer, Warcraft and Age of Empires. Your goal is to control the surrounding regions by building resources and hubs to dominate and secure areas against opposing forces, very like other well-known RTS games. Well-placed defences, plans and offensive strategies are necessary for victory. The game received much praise, stating it to be one of the best games of its type on the Genesis console.
Enemy unit approaching. Reporting. Acknowledged. Complete. Base under attack. Acknowledged.
The Terminator was published for several Sega consoles, including the Sega Genesis, the Master System and Game Gear in 1992, with them being an adaptation based on the 1984 film of the same name. The game was developed by Probe Software and published by Virgin Games, that follows the role of Kyle Reese being sent back from the future to save and protect Sarah Connor from the relentless pursuit of the menacing cyborg. The Terminator was praised for its graphics and sound, but was criticised for its gameplay due to the never-ending enemies that constantly spawn off screen, never giving a second to get familiar with the game's distinct levels reflecting locations from the movie. Despite the subtle flaws in reviews, it is still seen as one of the better quality movie adaptations seen from video games during this era. With the overall success of the movie and the high volume of sales made from the original Genesis game, Sega decided to capitalise on the trend by developing a spin-off sequel to the game with Jurassic Park Rampage Edition that utilises elements from the original game, being able to choose between Dr. Alan Grant and the Raptor once again, but the game would be much faster and more action focused compared to its predecessor. It primarily continues from where the previous game left off in terms of its story, seeing you explore more environments while gaining access to more powerful weapons with a taser, assault rifles, to shotguns and explosives to use alongside your standard medicine darts to stun enemies. But this time the darts actually kill the dinosaurs, unlike that seen in the first game. The game is short, having only 5 levels that will take you across the dinosaur infested island, but at times can be equally as difficult and as challenging as its predecessor, but fixes many of the flaws seen in the original game. This time however you can choose the levels you want to play through rather than being forced to play through everything in sequence. It is a decent alternative to the original game that stays true to the original game's idea on the Genesis that will also appeal to fans. I remember playing this game during my early years, one summer, staying over at a friend's house where he had rented it for the weekend, and we literally played through this for the entirety of the weekend until we completed it, and for its time it was one of the best games that we could have played on the console. It was so much fun. This isn't exactly a Genesis title, but a 32X game, but with the add-on needing the console to play these games, it is worth adding to this list. With the game being released in the arcade and the 32X in 1993, that would act as a sci-fi space shooter, flying a ship while being tasked with destroying many enemy crafts throughout each of the levels. You can change the viewpoint between first and third person perspectives to suit your style of play. The 32X version was well received, while having been downgraded to cope with the limits of the hardware, but it was also stated to be a solid port of the arcade original that had some great visuals, sound effects and gameplay that will appeal to fans of the film series. Rambo 3 is an overhead run-and-gun action game, developed and published by Sega based on the popular 1988 action film. It was one of the first movie-based games released for the system upon its release in 1989. There would also be a version of Rambo 3 released on the Sega Master System that would be a light gun shooter, also seen in the same year, and is considered one of the best games in the light gun genre on that console. Many ports of the game would see the way to other consoles and home systems of the time, each having their own perspectives surrounding the gameplay, with your goal being to reach the exit of each level after completing a set number of objectives, from saving prisoners, finding resources, defeating enemies, etc. before you can proceed. A solid experience that can be challenging, but one of the better examples released on the console. Ghostbusters is a platform shoot 'em up released on the Genesis console in 1990 and would be a very different experience from other games released on earlier consoles with the Master System, NES and home PCs that had different gameplay elements from driving to action and strategy. The Genesis version, however, stayed on its path, with it being an action platformer, requiring you to capture a number of ghosts in each level before facing off against an end level boss. The player can earn money by completing levels and objectives, which can be used to upgrade equipment and access more resources to aid in capturing ghosts. Reviews at the time were overall positive, but many found some of the level elements to be repetitive, and not having the inclusion of Winston Zeddemore slightly took away from the experience. There would, however, be more recent fan-made hack upgrades that includes Winston in the character roster, which you can find online, that also tweaks and overhauls some of the game's flaws that might be worth trying. A late addition to the Genesis, releasing in 1997, Jurassic Park: The Lost World would be among the many ports and adaptations of the movie releasing on consoles during this time that would also see the game finding home on newer, more powerful 32-bit systems with the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. The Genesis version is very different from its counterparts. It plays using an overhead perspective, exploring large environments while using vehicles and weapons to deal with the many dinosaur creatures that roam the lands. There is also a cooperative mode to work together to complete many of the game's challenges, which adds to the game's appeal. The Genesis version received decent feedback upon its release, with many preferring this edition compared to the other entries released, as it added more variety to the gameplay. Mortal Kombat is the first entry in the legendary series of fighting games that inflict scenes of grotesque and insane violence that caused much controversy surrounding its release in the arcade and on consoles in 1992. The game saw ports on many 8 and 16-bit consoles of the time that also spawned many sequels, with Mortal Kombat 2 and 3 being released on these systems also, with later iterations combining characters and elements all together in one package, with the likes of Mortal Kombat Trilogy on the Sony PlayStation. You have access to 6 playable characters that would become icons throughout the franchise, with the goal of winning the Mortal Kombat tournament to stop the Emperor Shao Kahn's Netherrealm from invading Earthrealm. It is one of the rare early occurrences where a movie would be adapted from the success of the video game. Usually it happens when a movie is successful, a video game usually follows not long after that, but in this case the movie wouldn't release until 1995. That would be a smash hit and take the series to new heights during that time. Michael Jackson's Moonwalker is an action platform game released for the arcade, Sega Megadrive and Master System in 1990, being inspired by the popular movie. Your goal is to explore the levels and hidden areas to rescue the kidnapped kids and put an end to the evil overlord. Moonwalker, alongside its arcade counterpart of the same name, is notable for being one of the earliest uses of direct celebrity endorsement in video game production. Both console versions were well received among fans and critics alike, stating it to be a solid experience with great visuals and excellent soundtracks that reflect some of the pop icon's most legendary music tracks. The Lion King is based on Disney's 1994 animated film that follows the journey of Simba from a young cub to battle with his uncle Scar as an adult to reclaim his kingdom. The game was developed by Westwood Studios and published by Virgin Interactive Entertainment for the SNES and Genesis in 1994, and would also be ported to the MS-DOS, Amiga, Sega Game Gear, Master System and NES consoles. There are many platforming elements along with a variety of boss fights and minigames, and the game can be quite challenging, especially in later stages, often considered to be among some of the most difficult of these games seen on these systems. The Lion King is currently one of the most popular and visually stunning Disney masterpieces ever seen on 8 and 16-bit consoles. Pocahontas is a cinematic platform game, taking many references from the movie that plays similar to games also seen with the likes of Prince of Persia and Flashback. Releasing on the Genesis, Megadrive console and was developed by Funcom on contract with Disney and was released in 1996. The game received a port on the Nintendo Game Boy, developed and published a year later. Players take on the role of Pocahontas along with the help of her animal companion Miko, switching between the two frequently to overcome obstacles. The player gains various new abilities from animal spirits by helping them when completing tasks along your journey, which follow many plot points seen in the film. It is an interesting game with some very impressive visuals, being among some of the best ever seen on the console, that present great attention to detail with beautiful backdrops, character animations and locations. Toy Story was one of the later entries to be released on the Mega Drive Genesis console in 1996 to coincide with the huge success of the animated movie. The game would follow the plot of the story, with the gameplay adding a variety of twists to change up the various dynamic styles you'll experience the further into the game you get. The platforming sections and boss scenes are among some of the most challenging and frustrating sections seen in the game. You are greeted, however, with many changes to the play style through many different level types, taken from other genres, from pseudo 3D racing with some impressive visuals to a top-down viewpoint in some of the levels, racing the RC car in a Micro Machines style format. But definitely the most impressive aspect of this entire game is the level where you must rescue the toy aliens from inside of the claw machine, that will take you through super high detailed first person 3D maze like levels where you have to find each of the aliens within a time limit and bring them to the exit. And the level design of this section would reflect those seen in iconic first person shooters with the likes of Wolfenstein 3D and Doom. And with these elements in mind, it's interesting to know why more games weren't developed using this style, as it showed that it was able to work better than expected. The Toy Story game, as with that seen in the movie, would sell in massively high volumes, and while it still may not be considered as one of the best games on the Genesis, even with all of the varieties that are available, but is still considered as one of the most impressive with its vast and unique ideas that were way different from anything else seen on the console during that time. Batman was developed by Sunsoft and released for the Sega Mega Drive in 1990. It was inspired by the 1989 Tim Burton directed Batman film. The game is one of the more faithful adaptations to the film's plot seen on systems, which also includes levels, which the player controls Batman's vehicles. The game is also a side-scrolling action platformer, seeing Batman being able to punch, kick, jump, glide and use items and weapons through the use of his utility belt. The game upon release received decent reviews, praising the gameplay and its faithfulness to the film, and praising the graphics and sound, and describing the backgrounds as somber looking. As the sets in the film noted, the game is short and not especially challenging. Still, it is a solid game and one of the better movie adaptations seen during this generation. Alien 3 is a side-scrolling run-and-gun game based on the movie of the same name that was developed by Probe Software and published by Arena Entertainment for the Megadrive, Master System, Game Gear, Amiga, NES, SNES and Commodore 64 in 1992. The player controls Ellen Ripley, the film's main character, who progresses through many locations featured in the film to save all of the prisoners being held captive before the timer runs out. The player can jump, shoot, climb ladders, crawl through tunnels, open doors and use elevators. Unlike in the film, Ripley has a large arsenal of weapons that can be used against the enemies in the game, which consist of aliens and facehuggers. Weapons include pulse rifles, flamethrowers and grenades. A motion tracker will also warn players of nearby enemies. The game makes use of its great, interesting level design and cool soundtrack, while also presenting a dark and gritty atmosphere with lots of tension, keeping you on edge as you play, as you are unsure where alien threats can come from. There are some small differences regarding each of the versions available, but are considered solid experiences that will definitely appeal to fans. Alien 3 was well received across all versions and is considered one of the best movie tie-ins on consoles during both the 8 and 16-bit eras of video games. Aladdin, when it released on the Genesis in 1993, would go down as being one of the best-selling games ever made on the console, with over 4 million copies sold. The game itself would also receive several adapted ports on other platforms with the NES, Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Amiga, DOS, along with the Sega Master System and Game Gear. The game would draw many references from the film, and the gameplay elements heavily focused on action and platforming, more so in the Genesis version, that would see you fight enemies with a sword and throwing apples, which you will acquire on your journey. This version of Aladdin also presents some of the most visually stunning graphics and character sprites seen of any game ever on the console itself, that would closely reflect scenes taken from the movie itself, all in great detail. The game would also boast great sound effects and an excellent music soundtrack that also contribute to the impressive gameplay, but it's more often seen as some of the closest renditions compared to the movie that you can see on consoles. If anything, this version of Aladdin is often considered as the best way to play the game on any of these systems. And while the game would be one of the most highest grossing titles in Sega's history, it would still fall short, as it would only fall behind Sega's other highest selling games ever with the first two Sonic games, with Sonic 2 being the highest selling game in Sega's history. The games shown here present many mixed opportunities for games that aspired for greatness, but many of them falling way short of that mark, pretty much never getting over the first hurdle, that have left tasteless experiences at the hands of many players over the years. But at the same time, there are experiences that have stood out, with some becoming among the greatest games developed for the Megadrive Genesis console, and being just as enjoyable to play now as ever. Whichever of these games you have played, there are many great experiences to be had, well, not including the bad titles, but even those games appeal to some players in their younger years, so we can't discredit them entirely. The games of this generation presented an unusual time for players, with many interesting titles that had something for everyone, but there are many more tales in store that dive deeper into the long history of titles available, which you can learn more about in this next video, that will look at even more interesting ideas and concepts that also made their impact on the world of video games.